Hi guys, I hope you're enjoying Module 5. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to prepare two videos. The first is to deal with some of the questions that arose from Module 4 around multivariate testing, around how to correctly set things up in terms of testing in the groups and some of the issues that people had. And then after that, I'm going to create a separate video where I'm going to talk about the hypothesis evaluation matrix, Module 5 stuff around some of the evaluation tools that I think some people are getting a little bit concerned about, a little anxious, and I think the important thing to know is that you don't need to feel as anxious as possibly you are feeling. Okay, so in terms of Module 4, I mean, thank you very much for some really, really great submissions. I think it's always very, very difficult when one's juggling work or other activities with studies to try and recruit people into your panel to formulate the questions in a way that's meaningful and then to also get through those test questions. I think, and this is not just true of this module, don't forget the learning outcomes. Don't become overly anxious in terms of what it is that we're looking for in terms of the raw artifact and the raw output. The one thing that you can be absolutely certain of is that you're going to find that with each time you prepare one of these artifacts, you're going to get better and better and better. And that isn't something that's going to be done in 10 weeks or in 10 months. Maybe it won't even be achieved in 10 years. It's something that you're going to constantly be evolving your practice. And the standards and expectations of users also are constantly changing. So I would encourage you all not to become overly anxious about how those skills develop, because it's going to be one of those things with the more practice you do, the better you're going to become at it. One of the big issues that sort of arose was this question of multivariate testing, and I think that it's important to go back to this idea of A/B testing, which really largely grows out of web design, web development, where you essentially take an element and you look at its efficacy in terms of what your desired outcome is between two options. Traditionally, that would be around driving signups, driving conversion. So if you're paying for ad traffic to land onto a product, you'd say, well, you know, I've done two things with the design, and this variant is possibly resulting in more signups, and therefore it's intrinsically good because it's achieving the outcome that I want. And that would be your traditional classical sort of bifocal A/B testing. Multivariant is kind of an extension of that, to kind of say, well, let's look at a whole bunch of different variations at rest and then change. Something important that I think possibly people got needlessly anxious about is the fact that you are not always going to have the opportunity to variate just simply a single element on your page, and you need to, or aspect of your product screen, so on and so forth. You need to recognize that you might have multivariate testing of individual features, you might have multivariate testing of entire products. Peter raised in the forums one of the questions around the fact that because we're looking at Yahoo Mail and we're looking at Gmail, that some users would be completely and utterly distracted by the fact that there were so many features different in something like the sign-up process, one having a captcha, one having more or less fields than the other. But I would say that there's quite a lot of signal in that noise in terms of what are the core things that you're trying to learn about the user in each of those cases. If we dumb it down to the extent of saying, well, when the button's on the left or the button's on the right, that level of A/B testing or multivariate testing, good human interface guidelines will sort of eliminate. Generally, when we're talking about multivariance testing, is we're saying wholly different flows. So, for example, shifting where a particular screen would happen in a sign-up process or in a buy process or in a transactional process. Case in point would be to say that, you know, let's think of ATMs. Once upon a time, ATMs would make a language choice after you captured your PIN number. Of course, that makes the assumption that you're going to happily put the card in, you're going to happily know to capture the 4 digits, and you'd have to hope that the PIN number paradigm would be strong enough, and then you'd ask the language question. And you can even see banks in South Africa today make different choices about when are we going to choose to show the language screen first versus when are we going to show the language screen post-PIN. And there's so many different factors that come into that. What you're wanting to try and do is you're trying and record what are the variations and what the impact is between those. So I would say that you're not necessarily always going to find, as desirable as it might be, a crisp answer. Over a larger panel size, so let's say a panel of a couple of hundred users, you'll find even more noise in your signaling. So that then also speaks to this concern about, oh, we had to find 2 people and we had to talk to them. 2 is is the smallest number other than 1. The fact is that when you do more large-scale testing, you're going to have a lot more people you can be talking to, potentially a lot more data that's going to be gathered, and therefore there potentially could be a lot more noise. One way of eradicating that noise is, as some of you have intimated, reduce down the differences. However, when you show an element in isolation to someone, and you don't put many different elements at contrast to one another, you might end up with inconclusive or actually incorrect results. In isolation, we might look at a particular feature and say, that's really, really nice, until we encounter that feature or that aspect in isolation. So a case in point is, we always want usability attention. We all say we want really, really small phones. We want thin phones, we want light phones. Then cell phone manufacturers say, okay, cool, we're going to need to take out the 3.5mm jack, and then that results in a variation where in isolation, if you said to someone, do you like the thick phone or the thin phone, the person might choose the thinner phone. However, when we take out the functionality of the 3.5mm headphone jack, we suddenly say, well, no, I would rather have the thicker phone. This is a way of example. Some of you also raised this stress about stats and testing and research. The core learning outcome that we're really trying to achieve here is, can we prepare a research plan? Can we prepare questions that we want to ask people? Number 2, can we find them? Can we recruit them? And building up those panels of people to recruit, it's difficult to find. And often you've got to co-opt users into that process. And then finally, can we test them, and can we try and make head or tails out of the information that we get from them? And I think that feeling of anxiety, that learning that it's difficult, is an important thing. I think a lot of the time when whether we're designers or we're not designers or developers, we have our own ideas about what products should be like, and it's only when we really start doing kind of guerrilla testing, street testing, corridor testing of ideas, we suddenly realize, hang on, wait a second, our assumptions of how an interface should work are not universal. The way in which users are going to interact with systems are not universal, and therefore there's a lot of value in coming to understand how users really do interact with those things. Remember, user testing in a sort of a lab environment is also not the be-all and end-all. A lot of the data that you're going to get in practice is from how users are actually using systems in the wild. And so in practice, you're going to want to look at things like conversion funnels and Google Analytics. You're going to want to understand what the user journeys are through applications, where drop-offs are happening, and so on and so forth. And whether or not those are being driven through user experience, or they're actually potentially being driven by product aspects that you can't change. So, for instance, you might have a really great user experience journey that gets the person to the sign-up form, but there's a business decision that you're going to charge 10,000 Rand for someone to sign up. There's no trial period, and then you might find you can have a lot of dropped-off traffic. Then it's no fault of the user experience, although potentially you should have started training the consumer as to the fact that you're going to, the sticker shock idea is going to be presented a little bit earlier, and therefore there might be aesthetic or design decisions around communicating the fact that this is a product that is going to have high cost, and then potentially balancing that with, where you're going to encounter higher cost, have a filter in the form of allowing people to sign up and then rather contact them through a sales funnel, so that you're not having to shock people with the price of your offering. So, yes, I think something I just want to encourage you to continue doing is to look at developing your own panel of people that you can trust to ask questions of. Recruit early and often when you're working with a product. Include all the stakeholders possible, and most importantly, don't become bogged down with the fact that there's a lot more noise in terms of your research results in reality than possibly what you might like. Recognize that there's a lot of ambiguity that comes through in any sort of research function, and what you're trying to do is you are trying to find that needle in the haystack. It is not simply a case of you're going to torture a metaphor that you're going to hit gold with first strike of the spade. You have to recognize that you need to return to questions, potentially sometimes with the same test subject. So to see also, how does the test subject engage with an interface multiple times? You can also discover reliability and credibility in terms of that evidence, and sort of now alluding to some of the points in Module 5, which I'll cover in the next video. But I think really, really importantly is These are tools that you need to practice, and these are things that you don't need to feel, hey, I had to get it right the first time. Some people are better researchers than others, but the thing that we all can do as UX practitioners is recognize that research is something that needs to happen, needs to underpin what is being done, and needs to be done to the greatest extent that one can, budget and time allowing. And that it's not something that requires a 10,000 person panel, and that the real art of it is not recruiting a large base of people to do the test. Sometimes that can be a bit of a problem. It's actually about how do we formulate the questions, how do we gather the information, and in what degree, when it comes to multivariate testing, how many elements do we bring together in contrast and in conflict with one another. I think if we look at the Google and the Yahoo situation, we can see here we have two products that essentially do the identical thing, and yet the interfaces can be so different. And the question we should be asking ourselves as UX practitioners is why? Why have those decisions been made by those respective UX teams? Why have they decided to do the things the way in which they have decided to do them? And if we don't ask those questions and we don't inquire as to why does that variation exist, then we aren't going to be able to think deeply about the decisions that we're going to make as practitioners in the months and years ahead as practitioners. So it's important whenever we look at an interface to say, what was the decision that was taken? Why do we believe it was taken? What evidence can we find that confirms our hypothesis as to why it was taken? And where we can't find evidence, does that mean that potentially that design is wrong or suboptimal? Or does it mean potentially that our sample size isn't large enough? Or have we potentially uncovered a superior pattern? And I think if you look at tools like Yahoo's and Google's, there's something not to be lost, which is the familiarity factor. When you look at a product like Google Mail, which has been around since 2006, it's coming up now on 11 years of being in the marketplace. That, or even longer than that, I think it's 2004, 2005. I mean, these are incredibly mature products. Mature products built on top of mature paradigms such as email, which has been around from the 70s. So you've got to then ask yourself, if something that is that mature, that present, still has conflicting interfaces, that means there's still opportunities for those decisions to be made and to be contrasted and to be thought about and to be studied. And so then when we're building a website or we're building a mobile application or we are working in a broader product design of a space that people are coming into that's going to be supported by digital experiences, we need to recognize that there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of complexity, who the audience is going to be, their computer literacy rates, their product literacy rates, their ability to understand what it is that we're going to convey are going to all have impact on what we're going to do. And therefore we need to test as much as possible, and we need to test our own assumptions and not just assert as UX practitioners what we believe is quote unquote the best practice. So this is something that I think you're going to continue using. I hope you all continue to use them and recognize and realize the necessity of research in building out our work.